I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In today's episode, as part of our examination of political free speech, we will be looking at anti-Semitism, and my guest will be Dr. Ben Gidley from the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism.
We're in a situation of kind of competitive victimhood in general in our time of identity politics, and that's probably one of the reasons people like to emphasize the racism against their own group and dismiss racisms against other groups. It's also heavily overdetermined by the conflict in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and all of the different echoes of that. And so when you talk about anti-Semitism, it immediately short-circuits to Israel-Palestine, and what position you take around that will make a big difference to how seriously you take anti-Semitism.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders.
I know people at home are fed up with politics. I hear you, and I want to be honest with you. We have not been good enough, and we need to be better.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
According to most political scientists and commentators, democracy is not doing very well at the moment. Liberal norms of democratic communication are in retreat. Political demagogues are jettisoning the rules-based order. Electoral legitimacy is being questioned by bad losers. We are witnessing a return to the 19th century great power order of might is right. Institutions of authoritative knowledge are in decline, challenged by post-truth epistemologies. Symbolic culture wars rage. Global markets have been reconfigured so they're increasingly dominated by finance, capital, and debtor nations. By any standards, democracy is in trouble. And historically, when democracy is in trouble, the politics of blame and scapegoating offers a lazy and malign alternative to the search for reason-based consensus. Blame the desperate migrants fleeing from wars and famines. Blame welfare recipients for being poor and unworthy of support. Blame the disabled for pretending to be ill. Each of these cruel culpabilities have found their way into contemporary political discourse. And then there are the ancient prejudices, regularly regurgitated when people are feeling frightened and confused, of which anti-Semitism, blaming Jews for social ills, is a hearty perennial. Anti-Semitism, it has been said, is a light sleeper, aroused in times of social disarray, when it is so much easier to find a group to blame than undertake the hard work of devising solution to social ills. The history of anti-Semitism in its most militant form hangs over our normative conceits like a dark shadow, reminding us that for all our talk of civilized disagreement, electoral legitimacy, encoded rights and deliberative reflection, it was less than 100 years ago that political rationality failed abjectly and millions of people were murdered in gas chambers in the name of a racist political project. That this pernicious project was led from Germany, a nation that had before then seemed to epitomise the tastes and precepts of civilised Europe, is a sobering reminder of the catastrophic consequences of political communication in its paranoid mode. The statistics of the Holocaust are stark. Before 1933, over 60% of the world's Jewish population lived in Europe, about 9.5 million people. 2 out of every 3 European Jews, amounting to 6 million people, were killed in the name of what the Nazis referred to as the final solution. Nearly a century after that attempted genocide, anti-Semitism is still alive and kicking. There are some people, a very small but vociferous minority, especially online, who deny that it ever happened, who claim that the Holocaust was simply made up by people who wanted sympathy. There are others who repeat the old Nazi anti-Semitic tropes about Jews controlling the world, often pointing to a vast conspiracy through which this 0.2% of the world's population is responsible for the sufferings of the other 99.8%.
I think if you look in terms of the European black nobility in collusion with certain Jewish families and banking houses at the top, as say in the Illuminati at the pyramid on the Great Seal of the United States, that would make sense that there's a collusion at the top between this black nobility and Jewish elements for world domination.
And even at the very top of politics, the old anti-Semitic tropes regularly slip out.
Think of that: no death tax, no estate tax, no going to the banks and borrowing from, in some cases, a fine banker, and in some cases, Shylocks and bad people.
There were 3,700 reported anti-Semitic incidents across the UK in 2025, a 4% increase from the year before. According to polling by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, 47% of British Jews now see anti-Semitism as, quote, a very big problem, up from just 11% in 2012. What is going on here? Is it, as I would assume, that in times of social crisis, people are falling back upon lazy prejudices? Or should we be looking for other reasons for the persistence of this ancient hatred? Of course, the elephant in the room here is the entanglement between Jews as a cultural minority constituting only 0.2% of the world's population and Zionism as a form of ethno-nationalism. I don't propose to ride that particular elephant in the room, except to say that if one is opposed in principle to ethno-nationalism, one should be opposed to all of its global manifestations. And when just one of those manifestations is selected for repeated condemnation, it is hardly surprising that the motive for such selection becomes questionable. Well, to help me understand what contemporary anti-Semitism is and how it finds its way into political discourse, I'm speaking today with Dr Ben Gidley, who's reader in Sociology and Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck, University London, and research associate at the Birkbeck Institute for the study of anti-Semitism. Ben Gidley, it's a really great pleasure to have you here on The Sound of Politics. This is a podcast where we're very interested in the significance of words and how words can be made intelligible across different groups. So I want to start by asking you, what does it mean to speak of anti-Semitism? Where did this term originate and what does it describe?
Thanks, Stephen. It's good to be here as well. The term itself is not a hugely ancient term. It was coined in the late 19th century in the German-speaking world by people that thought of themselves as anti-Semites. It was used as a positive term by people that hated Jews. And it was basically had a scientific ring to it that gave it maybe some respectability. But I think it named something that's much older. In the Bible, Sem or Shem was one of Noah's 3 sons, the one that stayed in Asia. And the Christians in particular in the medieval period, as they were starting to think about the shape of the world and where people lived, they thought of Jerusalem as at the center of the world and Asia, Europe, and Africa as the 3 parts of the disc. And that idea of a kind of biblical genealogy, a family of humanity with these 3 very distinct branches, sedimented in the period of the Crusades, which was also the time when Christian Europe was starting to know a little bit about some of the peoples that lived on the edges of their kind of known world. And so there's a Christian biblical history to the word Semite, the people that are descended from that family, which over time, as philology and history and archaeology kind of congealed in a more secular sort of scientific way after the Enlightenment, that they thought of the Semitic peoples and the Semitic languages as one of those branches of human people, the peopling of the world and the languages of the world. And today we still have the category of Semitic languages, including Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic, but the kind of idea that there are these biological families of humanity is somewhat discredited among scientists. And so there's no longer really an idea that Semitic people exist apart from in some sort of occult sort of raciological circles maybe. So it kind of really names hating Jews. So there's no such thing as a Semite, and that's why often the hyphen is taken out between anti-Semite, because it's against something that doesn't really exist. It's just a name for hating Jews. Hating Jews, I guess, goes back. I mean, you can look in the Roman period and earlier, there was ethnic conflicts between Jews and their neighbors. There's lots of stories of warfare in the Bible. It's really after Christianity was the state religion of the Roman Empire and then the state religion of the feudal monarchies that you start to get something like modern anti-Semitism, with ideas that Jews, conspire to suck the blood of Christian children, and the kind of various myths that Jews are usurers and that sort of thing that we're more familiar with. They start to emerge again around the time of the Crusades and then kind of congeal more and more into the modern period.
That's a very helpful historical definition. It seems to me that in contemporary culture, anti-Semitism seems to be treated either with exaggeration, the claim that large numbers of Jews are being forced to leave the country, rather like Jews at the time of the Tsarist pogroms or Nazi persecution, or with a certain dismissiveness, as if Jews are somehow overclaiming discrimination against themselves, that they're not really victims of discrimination or racism. Can you explain why these two extremes seem to prevail to such an extent, and any attempt at kind of an objective sense of what's going on seems to get lost?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That picture that you just painted of that polarization, is that binary, is exactly right. We're in a situation of kind of competitive victimhood in general in our time of identity politics, and that's probably one of the reasons people like to emphasize the racism against their own group and dismiss racisms against other groups. It's also heavily overdetermined by the conflict in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and all of the different echoes of that. And so when you talk about anti-Semitism, it immediately short circuits to Israel-Palestine, and what position you take around that will make a big difference to how seriously you take anti-Semitism. I think for many people in particularly the mainstream Jewish communities of Europe and North America, there's been a growing sense of insecurity since the start of the current century, the start of the Second Intifada, where anti-Semitism has increasingly been seen as an existential threat to Jews. And so it's very hard to sort of see it as anything other than a kind of a massive danger, whereas other people might look at it more comparatively and within the broad spectrum of racisms, and it might therefore seem less exceptional and less sort of panicky because it's, lots of racisms feel bad at the moment. And then I think one of the issues is, maybe how we measure anti-Semitism. And so we get a lot of news about incidents, including hate crimes, but not just criminal incidents. And these are measured, hate crime is measured by the police, and anti-Semitic incidents are measured by a Jewish communal charity in the UK, Community Security Trust. And so we get good headlines about, for example, anti-Semitism is worse than it ever was. And this often misses out maybe other ways we could measure it. For example, social scientists or polling companies that ask people about their attitudes, where we'd get a very different picture. It seems to be not growing, but in fact declining if we kind of measure it that way. And so I guess how it's measured, who measures it, how we interpret the measurement is part of that swirling competition in our discourse.
Well, I want to come back to that measurement question because I think it's really important. But I also want to come back to what you were saying about the current state of the Middle East. Clearly, not every European or American Jew is a Zionist, and less still a supporter of the Netanyahu government, just as not all Muslims support the corrupt government of Pakistan or the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia. How do you think, Ben, that discourse around Zionism can ever be distinguished from anti-Semitism? Or is it a sort of an inevitable and intractable entanglement?
I don't think it's inevitable and intractable. It's definitely very difficult, and it seems to be getting more and more difficult as our politics become more polarized. But I think that there are ways out with maybe clearer thinking and maybe more clarity about use of language. I mean, in Britain, we had a statistic from a very good survey that was done in about, I think, 2010 that told us that 73% of British Jews identified as Zionists. And so if you're attacking Zionists, you're attacking a very large number of kind of British Jews, and an even larger number maybe have family in Israel, have been there, feel emotionally close to it. Interestingly, there's a more recent survey just before the current war, cycle of war in 2023, that found that number had gone down quite a bit to 63%. So still a majority, still very much the mainstream, but a bit smaller. And then a year or so into the war, another survey, again done by an organization called the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, JPR, found a slight bounce up back to 65, but also that more Jews identified as not Zionist or as anti-Zionist, and the don't knows had fizzled away. And that's another sign of polarization within the Jewish population. And in fact, in Britain, among younger people under 29, it's now just 49% describe themselves as Zionist. So it's kind of the case, if you attack Zionists, you are attacking a lot of Jews. It's not the case that in attacking Zionists, you're attacking all Jews, but Jews do feel kind of personally bound up in it, sometimes critically, some more often positively. And I guess just precision about what it is you're criticizing, what it is you're against, knowing that people mean different things when they say the word Zionism. For example, that a Zionist or an anti-Zionist might mean something completely different by the same word, are some of the ways that we could kind of disentangle that.
It seems to me there lies a point, because, I mean, for example, somebody could say that they feel strongly attached to Britain or to the United States, but that would not correlate with them being strongly in favour of every British government policy or every act of Donald Trump. And so it clearly gets complicated, but I also wonder whether one could look at it the other way and say, in a sense, is it not perfectly legitimate to assume that when criticism of Zionism happens, it can somehow almost unintentionally drift into anti-Semitism, that there's a certain disingenuity amongst people who sort of try to make a clean distinction between the two, which incidentally I often try to do. But maybe it's disingenuous because in the end, when people really dislike a ethno-nationalist movement, they will dislike the people who support it, and they will start to dislike things that they didn't ever start out wanting to dislike. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. I think it is possible analytically to distinguish them, but it is also, as you say, hard to keep a kind of clean, dry, neat wall between them. And I think there's a few ways. I mean, so sometimes people use the word Zionist as a euphemism, as a kind of code word. That's not what they really mean. And maybe two people might say identical things, and one of them really means Jews and the other really means Zionists. And it's very hard to be sure which is which without having a lot of contextual information. There's also when some of the old myths and stereotypes and narratives about Jews get attached to Israel, that you can say it enters a territory where anti-Semitism is at least a risk. And then I think there's a sort of phenomenon where Zionism is kind of thought of as a real absolute metaphysical evil that exceeds any empirical, actually existing Zionism. And that maybe, I don't know if anti-Semitism is the right way of thinking about that, but certainly that it has a propensity more than any other kind of nationalism I can think of to kind of shift into that territory of kind of metaphysical hatred.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I said I want to come back to this question of measurement. I mean, you will know much more about the polling than I do, but I've looked at it and it's both kind of reassuring and worrying. What's reassuring is that when you take all of the kind of key tropes and you ask representative samples of the British population, do you think the Jews run the media? Do you think the Jews control the government? So on and so forth. It's really quite a small minority consistently who think that that is the case. But on the other hand, it's worrying because that small minority constitutes, at the very least, hundreds of thousands of people, if not more. Where should we go with that sort of thinking about measurement? Should we be worried by the measurement or should we be reassured?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in some ways, I mean, I think the important thing is that people, when they are being worried or being reassured, that they're starting with the facts, as you just identified very accurately. So it's an active interpretation to decide, is that good or bad? Me and my colleagues at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, so we think about that. Those people that say yes to a lot of those negative statements about Jews, we think of those as the anti-Semites, the hardcore people with an anti-Semitic worldview. And as you say, they're just a couple of percent of the population. It's a pretty small percent, but again, as you say, that's a large absolute number. And then around it, I think we can think of a sort of much bigger penumbra of people that maybe dip into some of the myths and stereotypes of anti-Semitism from time to time. And so we distinguish between anti-Semites, a relatively small, identifiable, specific problem, and then the wider, more diffuse issue of anti-Semitism. And I think distinguishing between those is helpful. We can think about the political challenge in relation to each of those is different. And I guess the people that are the hardcore anti-Semites, some of them, like a very small number of them, are the perpetrators of some of the most horrific incidents. You can think of the murderous attack in Manchester, like a highly motivated anti-Semitic attack. But a lot of anti-Semitic incidents are not necessarily the most anti-Semitic people perpetrating them. It might just be, a drunk young man outside the pub on 11 o'clock, and if somebody else was there, somebody else might have been the target. So, it's important not to think of anti-Semites as the whole of the problem.
Yeah, no, I like that distinction between anti-Semites and anti-Semitism. You wrote a really very good article, I thought, in the Political Quarterly a few years ago, criticising the way in which anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, particularly under Jeremy Corbyn, was reported and discussed. Your view seemed to be, very clearly was, that the claim that the Labour Party had been taken over by anti-Semites was a mistaken view.
Yeah, that's right. So it's an article that I wrote with David Feldman, a historian, and Brendan McKeever, a sociologist, and we looked at, in particular, some of the metaphors that people used for what had happened in the Labour Party as a way of thinking about it. And we noticed this word virus cropping up again and again, both from people, including Jeremy Corbyn himself and some of his supporters, and his kind of most harsh critics, Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, for example. They're either saying there's a few bad apples, you can kind of cast out those bad apples and it's the body is basically healthy, or they're saying like the virus has afflicted the entire body. And this, I think this metaphor exactly assumes that the problem is one of anti-Semites, not of anti-Semitism. And what we try to argue is that people often unintentionally, including people that see themselves as anti-racist, kind of dip into a reservoir of myths and tropes about Jews that's really deep in our culture, going back at least to the Crusades, and that maybe they do so when Jews are kind of salient in the news. So when something happens in Israel-Palestine, or during the Corbyn period when when anti-Semitism itself was in the news. And so people were thinking about the topic. And so people kind of reach into that reservoir at that time. So it's not an issue of like, who are the bad apples? Let's discipline them. It's an issue of how to, basically anti-racist or decent people kind of dip into this malignant reservoir in our culture.
And it was a very good article. I recommend people to read it. Is there, Ben, a problem of anti-Semitism in universities in countries like the UK and the USA? And if there is, to any extent, what's the best thing to do about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's become quite a kind of politicized question. I think that there definitely is anti-Semitism within universities. There are people that draw on that reservoir when, for example, they start protesting around Gaza and what Israel's doing there, that some of those myths and stories from the anti-Semitic reservoir kind of come to the surface. What I don't think there is a problem of is if we make that distinction between anti-Semites and anti-Semitism, that there's a kind of a significant number of hardcore anti-Semites in British universities. And I think also the strategy that successive governments have taken of sort of making a very zero tolerance, getting universities to sign up to particular definitions of anti-Semitism that kind of have quite a low bar for what counts, and taking a kind of zero tolerance attitude sometimes might even have a kind of negative impact of making people feel that anti-Semitism is being treated differently. Universities in general are being told you've got to protect free speech, you've got to uphold everybody's right to be offensive. Universities might be places where people hear uncomfortable views. And so I would say that instead of kind of going down that zero tolerance disciplinary route, universities need to think of this much more as a challenge for kind of literacy, consciousness, education, in the way that maybe other racisms also, students and staff perhaps need to know more. We get a lot of training, people that work in universities, about various biases. We get very little training about anti-Semitism. There's kind of quite low literacy about it compared to other kind of inequalities and discriminations. And perhaps if we just understood it a bit better, that would be the right path rather than making it into a big kind of disciplinary issue.
Right. And just to be specific, that literacy work would be done within the same territory, under the same rubric as a kind of decolonization project.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think that what's happened because of that polarization we were talking about before, we've got a situation where some forms of racism, often color-coded, black, white, often attached to images of the colonial versus the decolonial, the West versus the global South. And the anti-Semitism, there's a lot of students and some staff very conscious of those forms of racism, and anti-Semitism just doesn't quite fit into that. And so if you get any kind of anti-Semitism education, it's often maybe talking about the Holocaust, it's maybe talking about, it talks a very different language. And so it's very hard to kind of place it into the same framework. I think part of the issue is that dominant US framework for thinking about racism in very black and white terms doesn't fit Europe. And also that the way people talk about anti-Semitism has lost touch with basic anti-racist values. And there needs to be some kind of rebooting of our understanding that brings those two together.
Well, I always like to conclude these interviews by, if I can, touching on the personal a little bit, and really asking you about your own experiences of anti-Semitism and how, in any sense, what you do as an academic and the questions you try to answer and the articles that you're passionate about writing are, in some respects, infused by something experiential that you would like your readers and listeners to know about?
That's a really interesting question. I often tell my students to kind of answer that sort of question as they do their dissertations. And interestingly, I rarely talk about it when I talk about anti-Semitism myself. I come from a kind of mixed background. My mother comes from a Jewish family, so I was brought up very much on the fringes of a Jewish world. It wasn't something I was kind of brought up deep within. As a school kid, growing up in a place where there were almost no Jews, very white place in the West Country, 70s and 80s, I did experience kind of, not a huge amount, but kind of old-fashioned anti-Semitism. And it definitely made me feel like, that was probably the start of my interest in racism in general. kind of forms of othering, anti-Semitism in particular. And I guess over the years, I've seen in universities, and I'm very much on the political left, so within the left, within the Labour Party, within the broader left, seeing again and again people that are maybe my friends and allies, I guess, going back to that metaphor of the reservoir, kind of dipping into the reservoir of anti-Semitism and making it very hard to have a kind of serious, thoughtful conversation about things like Israel-Palestine, what's going on in Gaza. And I think, from the point of view of the left, from the point of view of academic projects, like you mentioned, decolonialism, that if people don't really do the work to understand anti-Semitism and its deep history, its real massive importance to European identity, then we're kind of never going to, have a left that, or a, academic world that can actually confront issues like what's going on in Gaza in a serious and thoughtful way.
And are you optimistic about that?
Yeah, I'm pretty pessimistic, and maybe more so as time goes by. I mean, the period since October 2023 has seen a real deepening of some of the polarization and the kind of intractable feeling nature of that debate. And I think in particular a lot of Jews, particularly if they're part of the mainstream community, are feeling so scared and under attack that they have become kind of distrustful of academia. They no longer see the anti-racist movement as on its side. So I think we've got to do a lot of work to rebuild that trust. And I'm not optimistic in the short term.
Well, Ben, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you and to learn from your research. I hope that if not just this interview, but the whole Sound of Politics series that it feeds into might just contribute in a small way towards you feeling a bit more optimistic as time goes on. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders.
I know people at home are fed up with politics. I hear you, and I want to be honest with you. We have not been good enough, and we need to be better.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.